Okay, going live. I cannot see you internet people. If you are there, I'm going to issue a warning. I've had some intermittent internet issues today. Hopefully the network will stick with us, but I'm just going to wait a minute or two. I hope you're all having a good mushroom season so far, such as it is. I was able to find a couple of things yesterday, which was really pretty special. It's been very dry in my neighborhood lately, so it's very peculiar. This is kind of like a Zoom call, except with like a completely disembodied audience. I have no idea who is here, who isn't, but whoever is here, I hope you're having a lovely one so far. So I'm going to wait for just another minute and get started. But if you are brand new to mushroom hunting, welcome to the strange world of mycophilia. Translated into English, that means loving mushrooms and loving fungi. So I'm going to dive right in just a moment here. But I'm Anna McHugh, and I'm really hopeful that it will rain in this coming week. That's my #1 wish. All right, so I'll give folks until 2:01, but I think my mom RSVP'd for this event, and I want to thank her for this photograph of me as a small child with an umbrella and boots and maybe a little bit of dishevelment on my trousers. Things haven't changed very much as far as my ability to dress myself, but my mother's always had a good eye for photographs. All right, cool. So I'm going to get started. Again, welcome. My name's Anna McHugh. This is Mushroom Hunting Foundations. So what I'm going to do today is cover sort of the basics of how to forage for mushrooms, how to observe them in the wild and start to identify them. And also I'm going to cover some of the common edible, toxic, and beautiful mushrooms in the southeastern United States. I'm based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, so my sort of area and habitats are, oak-based, and I have a lot of deciduous woods, but we also have a lot of pine, and so there's a really good, diversity and spread of different mushroom species. So I started hunting mushrooms a long time ago on the West Coast, and coming to North Carolina in 2013, it was a real delightful discovery to find that we had such a bountiful variety of species and just years and years worth of learning ahead of me. But let's talk about the agenda and what we're going to discuss today. First of all, I want to talk about mushroom basics. So where do fungi live, how to find them, and how to harvest them. I also want to talk about foraging and best practices for foraging. So really when you're hunting for mushrooms, there's a lot of different things that you can do to make your life easier and to make it more enjoyable. And so I'll talk about some of that. Similarly, I want to talk about taxonomy and lifelong learning. So when you get into this hobby, it becomes pretty immediately apparent that it's very, very challenging because there are many, many different mushroom species, many hundreds and thousands of them. And so taking an approach to learning the different species, it kind of, you have to make a decision of how much time you have to invest. And I'm going to introduce a couple of strategies for somebody who's more on the hobbyist side of things. So I sort of bump along at I would think of myself as an advanced novice, and I'd love to stay there for as many years as I possibly can, because beyond that it can be pretty daunting if you don't have a ton of time. So I'll talk about also identification tips and kind of how to orient yourself when you're identifying mushrooms in the field, and how to get better at that and get help when you need to get help from people who are more expert. Then we'll talk about species of the Southeast, so some of the novice-friendly edible mushrooms, some of our poisonous species, and then some mushrooms that I just really enjoy finding. You know, it is very difficult for me to pin down. You know, people will occasionally say, well, what's your favorite mushroom? And I'm like, my favorite mushroom to find, my favorite mushroom to eat, my favorite mushroom to see on a Saturday morning. You know, there's a lot of dimensions to what make mushrooms interesting and fascinating to me, but I'm going to talk about a couple of them that I like. And then finally, I'll talk about mushroom arts and leisure. So one of the biggest challenges in being really into this hobby, and it can kind of catch you and, you know, your imagination runs away with you and you find yourself thinking about mushrooms all the time. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that you can do when mushrooms are not fruiting outside, because it's very difficult to, you know, sustain a positive attitude when it's very dry. Speaking of very dry, I'm going to have a sip of water. But I will also explain to you why I'm here and what gives me the nerve to talk to you about this subject. All right, so I'm not going to talk to you about why I'm here in an existential sense of things. And I'm really also not going to be able to say with any degree of confidence what precise red Russula mushroom this is. And the reason I say this is that I have been a mushroom enthusiast since December 5th of 2008. And it was a very bad date and a very good activity that we went on. So I have not spoken with the fellow that I went out mushroom foraging with, gosh, since probably 2 weeks after that, you know, dreary Saturday morning. However, I have been fascinated and really captivated by mushrooms ever since. That said, you know, it is not my profession. I am not a formally trained mycologist. I've simply, you know, pursued observing them in the wild, collecting them both to eat, but also just learning their names, learning where they live is really one of the most rewarding parts of mushroom hunting and mushroom foraging. So it always gets me out into the forest. It gives me an opportunity to observe habitats in a much more nuanced way. And, you know, nonetheless, I am not overly ambitious. You know, red Russula mushrooms, to contextualize for those who have never done any mushroom hunting before, Russula is a genus that is massive. So in North Carolina, well, and, you know, you'll find them all over the world, I think, but certainly many hundreds of species, and many of them are different tones of red or purpley red or pink. And distinguishing between them is really, at a certain point, impossible. Not just from a glance, but even if you are very expert, you have microscopes and the best resources and patience in the world, identifying a red Russula mushroom as a red Russula mushroom is fine and dandy, especially if you are, you know, again, at this mushroom enthusiast and mycophile level that I feel really comfortable with. All right. So how I got here, and, you know, one of the things that sort of brought me to, you know, talking to you on a live stream this afternoon is I have been hunting mushrooms for a very long time, as I mentioned. I did a radio documentary about them way back in 2011, so I spent a good bit of time running around interviewing mushroom people, and that was really rewarding. And then I just sort of, you know, did this as a hobby. And COVID came, and all of a sudden I was spending a lot more time out in the woods and really had a little bit more time to invest in, you know, learning the taxonomy and getting better at the science side of things. And I started to make YouTube videos, because the way that I learn is by acquiring knowledge, and then, you know, if I cannot explain something, I don't truly understand it. And I really just enjoy sitting around in mushroom patches and talking to the mushrooms that I've found. It's really fun. It also has changed and shifted my perspective a little bit away from the food, although of course I still love to find, you know, wild mushrooms that are edible, but it gave me a chance to also say, okay, I can't be around humans. I can spend time, you know, appreciating these organisms, talking to them, talking about them, and occasionally carving menacing messages on blue staining ones when people were visiting parts of the woods that I thought they ought not. I also started drawing mushrooms in my spare time, and so this is a picture that I drew of honey mushrooms in the Armillaria genus. So, speaking of Armillaria, I have a picture here of Armillaria doing a very unusual thing, which is turning into one of our fine edible species. So Entoloma abortivum is actually a fungus that attacks honey mushrooms and turns it into what people call shrimp of the woods. So Entoloma abortivum is parasitizing another fungus. And honey mushrooms then turn into this really delightful sort of popcorn shrimp type thing. It's marvelous, it's weird, and it's a great example of some of the strange biology that you start to see when you look at mushroom biology and their life cycles and the things that they do in order to reproduce. However, that said, there are some mushroom biology basics that we can cover that I think are really valuable, especially if you're getting started with mushroom hunting. Understanding how the organisms grow is not just an academic pursuit. It really directly helps you find mushrooms in the future. And this is also one of the reasons I don't rely a lot on applications that will do, image-based recognition. I love to find not just mushrooms and identify them. I like to find and identify mushroom patches. And so when I find a, particularly cool situation and mushrooms that I like, I'm looking at the trees that are around, I'm looking at the, sources of organic matter that the fungus might be consuming, all kinds of different factors. And again, that's also that sort of just sit around and appreciate nature thing that I really get a kick out of. So when you're hunting for fungi, you really want to understand what the food source of the organism is. So to back up a whole bunch, fungi are a massive kingdom of species. They cannot produce their own food. So like, us in the animal kingdom, they have to find some sort of external source of food. And so they produce a lot of enzymes that break down and basically digest different things within their environment. So there is a lot of mushrooms that are decomposers, and that's their primary, strategy. So what you have, and if you're not familiar, a fungus is made up of what's called mycelium. It is a fine network of cells that is basically permeates its environment. It grows through its habitat and will basically exude digestive juices out into its habitat and then absorb, food back in. It is a really interesting time when these fungi decide to produce mushrooms because they reach the surface of whatever they're growing through and they detect either, or it's a combination of moisture and fresh air and sometimes a little bit of sunlight, and they're like, it's time to make fruit, and that will produce mushrooms that, spread spores far and wide that allow the mushroom to, allow the fungus to, reproduce and carry on its biological heritage. So mycelium, however, most of the time it's going through its habitat and being kind of vegetative. And so you have decomposers, and they're, again, exuding digestive juices into their habitat and taking, back in these different molecules that they've broken down. You also, so those are mushrooms that you will find oftentimes growing on wood, mushrooms that you'll find growing on leaf litter and so forth. And so decomposers, you have a whole bunch of species like oyster mushrooms and, a lot of your agaricus mushrooms. So the ones you find in the store, they are decomposers primarily. And so, finding them and looking at what they're growing on is a really, important thing to do. And so if you find something growing on wood, you can almost always surmise that it is decomposing in some way. There are exceptions, because it's mushrooms, always exceptions. We also have parasitic species, so honey mushrooms. I was just actually in this photograph. Armillaria is highly, those fungi are highly parasitic and can really do a lot of damage and kill trees. So we have fungi that strangle and basically steal all of the nutrition and from the trees that they are trees and plants that they're attacking. We also, and the most, to me, the most interesting from a mushroom hunting perspective are the mycorrhizal species. And so mycorrhizae, or mycorrhizal mushrooms are essentially mutualists. So they buddy up with a tree or plant partner, And what the fungus does is it supplies, moisture, also minerals, and it provides some degree of protection to the root system of its tree partner. And in exchange, the tree or plant partner supplies photosynthetic sugars. And so unlike a parasite that is stealing sugars, or unlike a decomposer that's just breaking down dead material, mycorrhizal mutualistic relationships are essentially a mutually beneficial trade. And it's interesting from a mushroom hunting perspective because a lot of the mushrooms you find growing on the forest floor are mycorrhizal. And so when you see a mushroom that's just sort of popping up from the ground, sometimes it's a decomposer, but oftentimes it's growing in association with a nearby tree or plant. And that's where identification gets really interesting. That's also why a lot of the mushrooms that people love from a culinary perspective can't be cultivated, because it's not just cultivating a fungus, it's cultivating a fungus and a very specific tree or plant partner. Then you have mushrooms and fungi that have blended lifestyles. And so, the oyster mushroom, for instance, Pleurotus austriatus, it acts as a decomposer and is very, very effective at decomposing all kinds of different material. It is also parasitic, so it will attack living trees and living plants. And then, in addition to that, occasionally, if it comes into contact with nematodes and other microscopic bugs, it exudes a paralytic agent, basically, that paralyzes these little microscopic bugs and consumes them. And so Pleurotus austriatus is parasitic, it is decomposing, occasionally carnivorous. So mushrooms are very, very fungible in the way that they support themselves. All right, so let's talk about mushroom hunting and the basics of that. So if you've never gone mushroom hunting before, one of your first concerns might be, how do I avoid poisoning myself? And that is an excellent question, a question you should ask yourself anytime you try a new wild mushroom for the first time. That said, I want to give you some reassuring safety data about why it is that mushroom poisoning is exceedingly rare. And the long and short of it is, there aren't a lot of mushroom species that are deadly poisonous. So we have, some mushrooms in the Amanita genus. We also have deadly Gallerina mushrooms, so they're little brown mushrooms that grow on wood. They are very, very toxic. And a number of others, some unusual sort of toxic mushroom types. And if you want to get into mushroom toxicology, it's really interesting and fun. But the long and short of it is, we have many thousands of species, and many that are very easy to identify and don't look like anything toxic. And furthermore, we just don't, by the numbers, see that many people who poison themselves. So over the course of 99 to 2016, this is information from NIH, we had about 2.8 fatalities per year in the United States from mushroom hunting. It's about 0.5% of those incidents cause any kind of major harm. And so most, 99.5% of the cases, somebody is barfing overnight, or they, go really, really green at the gills, and then essentially recover, and there's absolutely no lasting harm except maybe the psychological damage of going through a mushroom poisoning event. Another thing to consider is that Amanita and Gallerina, those are the two really toxic sort of, genera that we have to be cautious of. There are others, but those are the primary sources of, highly toxic mushroom poisoning events. The mortality rate is less than 9%, and that's because we have really, good treatment options. And so clinical outcomes have been improving. They're certainly better in the US than, places where it is more difficult to get aggressive and urgent care. And it's certainly not something like, you don't want to be in the ICU with a failing liver for a couple of days. So I don't want to trivialize, the possibility. But if you're familiar with mushrooms and you learn a couple of basic safety things, you have really nothing to worry about. All right, so let's talk about foraging, safety tips, and harvesting, ways to go about being successful with your mushroom foraging adventures. All right, so first things first. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew as far as the number of mushroom species you want to identify your first time out. If you are brand spanking new to the hobby, or you've only done it a couple of times, I highly recommend saying, okay, today I am going to go out and I'm going to look for chanterelle mushrooms, and I maybe will collect a couple of other things that I'll try to identify, but you really can do a lot of good by focusing on smaller groups of things and focusing on, like, I want to learn about X type of fruiting body instead of just collecting and trying to, you know, identify everything that you find. That is a fool's errand. You'll just drive yourself bananas. That said, if you're interested in eating mushrooms, getting a second opinion, you know, and just to verify identification is highly recommended. The best way to do this is on the internet. And what you want to do is take pictures of the mushroom from multiple angles. And so, you know, I really recommend engaging with different regional forums. You know, there's some Facebook groups that are quite good. What you want to do is, you know, take pictures of the mushroom from multiple angles and post it and say, hey, I think it's this. No one's ever going to get mad at you for taking too many good pictures of a mushroom. Where you start to get into trouble getting help with the verification is when you have a picture of just like the top of the cap, because, you know, if you have the picture of the top of your friend Mike's head, there's no way that you could tell them apart from, you know, Matt or, you know, a variety of other human beings that have a similar head top. Weird, but there we go. So, you know, taking pictures from multiple angles is also a really good way to get up close and personal with the fruiting body, and that is the best way to gain experience. Like, honestly, after a while, identification is really fun because the mushrooms that you want to find and eat, you know the gestalt of them, and you kind of like notice the shapes of them out of the corner of your eye, and you don't even really have to go through, okay, it has this feature, and this feature. You just sort of know after a while. And taking pictures and interacting closely and ripping them apart is a really good way to get to know your mushrooms. Speaking of gestalt and spotting mushrooms, so I really enjoy taking a nice leisurely pace. You know, hiking like at 3-4 miles an hour is really not gonna cut it unless you are only gonna pick things that are super duper obvious. I also really enjoy taking my time to sort of walk along the lower part of a hill, and I look up the hill, not down the hill, because you start to notice not just the shapes of or the colors of mushrooms, but also mushroom shapes. Because if you're looking up a hill, a mushroom will start to pop up and you can start to see its gills or whatever the undersurface is. And it's a really fun way to spot them. And so, you know, oftentimes I find that my fortunes are best when I'm going up and not down the hill. When we talk about gathering mushrooms, it is okay to pluck mushrooms from the base. I have a link at the bottom of this slide to sort of an overview of 57 years worth of research on the difference between cutting mushrooms off at the base or plucking them, because there's been concern that, you know, plucking a mushroom up would harm the mycelial mat and the actual, like, real fungal body underneath. The reality is, mushrooms are fruit. They're intended to be eaten. Their entire biological purpose is to come up and to throw spores everywhere, and, you know, so our suspicions that that was the case turn out to be, you know, pretty well supported by the evidence. So you can pluck mushrooms. What I really like to do is I will, you know, pluck them, and then I trim them off, and I'm very, very fastidious about cleaning them in the field. Especially because, you know, one of the things that is always a temptation, especially if you find a really good patch of mushrooms, is to just pick like crazy, and you pick every good mushroom that you see. And after a while, especially if you're dealing with a species like chanterelles that have a lot of like little ridges and grooves, they start to get dirty and mushy in your basket. And also you get home and you're like, oh my God, now I have to clean all of these and eat all of these in a not all that long period of time. So what I like to do is I will, you know, pinch or pluck my mushrooms. I trim them. I'm very, you know, I will clean them up and then sort of ruffle the remains back into the duff. And typically I take what I can eat or store within 3 days. And the reason being, you know, it's oftentimes fun to like give mushrooms to friends, but and, you know, there's a lot of ways to get rid of a very, very large bounty, but I tend to just take my time with it, and I'm happier that way. Other things to be successful with mushroom hunting, this may seem self-evident, but isn't. Secure your scene, so make sure you have keys, make sure people know where you are, and make sure you know where your animals are. And also make sure that you're aware of animals that you share habitat with. So, you know, even though it's okay to pluck mushrooms, for instance, it's really important to, you know, be safe around wild animals and also respectful of the habitats that you visit. Additionally, if you go with other people and you have, say, a carpool, make sure that you have everyone when you leave. I know that also may sound self-evident, but I have been on more than one foray where it was like, where's Bob? Probably back down at the coast. So you got to make sure that you're just being really mindful. And on that subject, don't get lost. And I cannot say this, you know, emphatically enough. Do not get lost. So, you know, when we talk about the dangers of wild mushroom hunting, yes, you can poison yourself, but honestly, the things that I am the most worried about are being lost, no one knowing where I am, getting bitten by a copperhead very far away from a trailhead. So, and even if you are lost in a very trivial way, it is scary. I actually found myself, or lost myself, about 1/3 of a mile away from my friends. And because the mushrooms were so wonderful that day, I had no idea if I was, you know, 1/3 of a mile too far north or too far south, because you're looking at the ground. And the idea that you're somehow going to be able to look up and like moor yourself is not a realistic expectation. So you have to be just very mindful of that. Fortunately for me, I was able to find my way back to the cars, and it went from a scary event to a mildly embarrassing event. But it also taught me a lesson to be really aware of my surroundings. All right, so let's talk about taxonomy and sort of the best way to pursue wild mushroom identification. So if you start to get into taxonomy, you will, or, you know, into wild mushrooms really, you will start to realize how many hundreds and thousands of species there are to learn, and many of them that are not even described. There's a lot of them that are like provisionally named, and they're parts of tribes and clades and a variety of other permutations in the scientific nomenclature to put them in a good spot until scientists and mycologists have an opportunity to figure out actually what they are. That can make it very, very daunting for someone who's sort of a beginner, or, you know, will consistently, like me, I love mushroom hunting, but I'm never going to be able to stay fully up to date with everything that's happening in mycology land. So if you're about to fall into the mycology wormhole, I recommend learning to identify mushrooms to genus. And so, you know, if you were, for instance, trying to get started with staying safe from dangerous Amanita mushrooms, you want to avoid large mushrooms that have white gills and also a cup or sac of tissue at the base. So, you know, we have a variety of different genera of mushrooms that have really good sort of identification features that allow you to form categories, and that really accelerates your learning a great deal. And once I got to about, you know, 20 or so species, I was kind of resistant to starting to learn the Latin and get into the scientific naming, especially because it changes so radically. And then I realized it's like, oh, this is just the taxonomy. It's flawed, it's complicated, but it's just a container for my knowledge. But because it's a structured and organized container, it's a lot easier than the common names, which are kind of all over the place, especially when you're looking at mushrooms that have a lot of similarities but aren't exactly the same thing. And it's also just important to note, mushroom names change all the time. They're just like goth kids. You have to get used to it. If a mushroom wakes up one morning and says, you know what, I'm Sebastian today, I am no longer, you know, Armillaria tubescens, you just have to go with the flow. And that's one of the things that I, you know, really, after a while, I almost find it to be more like following sports than anything else. I think it's the best approach. And in light of that, I call it the Bobby Mcferrin method. So I do my very best when I'm finding mushrooms that I'm really interested in that moment, to understand what they are, what the current name is. And these are some of the resources that I rely on as a sort of like, you know, ongoing, lifelong beginner, if you will. So first of all, regional field guides are extremely helpful. And I say regional field guides in particular because there are some, you know, North America wide, or, you know, much, much larger sort of breadth of geography in books, and if you're getting started, that can be very, very daunting. It can also be very difficult to really narrow things down to what you're likely to see and find. And so every now and again, like I'll be on a mushroom forum and someone new will come in and say, I need to buy a mushroom book. What mushroom books should I get? And someone says, Mushrooms Demystified, which, if you're not familiar, is ginormous and has like 1,600 species in it or something. And it's all full of dichotomous keys. It's like, that is not the right book. The right book is something that will show you some reasonable photographs of things that are reasonably likely to be in your area and also have good categorization of information. As far as the internet is concerned, Mushroom Expert is a really very helpful site. If you are not familiar with using dichotomous keys, it's a really good place to start doing that. If you don't know what a dichotomous key is, essentially it's just a list of paired statements that help you identify a mushroom. So it's like, if it's red, then go do, it's like a choose your own adventure except a lot more basic. And Mushroom Observer has a number of keys that will help you, not necessarily, and in some cases all the way down to species, but oftentimes will help you with grouping big genera or subgenera or families of mushrooms so you can get better at them. People on Facebook who aren't awful can be really not awful and wonderful. There are a number of different forums where there's a lot of really active and very knowledgeable identifiers. And additionally, iNaturalist is one place that I go, especially if I want to find a lot of observations of the same mushroom. One of the things about mushroom hunting is like their variability is massive. And so I will go to iNaturalist and look up a species, and then I filter it by research grade, so you can filter the observations to get rid of things that have not been verified, and then you can see all kinds of different, essentially variations of the same, species, which is really helpful. But the long and short of it is you just have to kind of, don't worry, be happy your way through it. This is a great example. I love this mushroom species. This is Exudoporous frostii, and it got renamed Butyriboletus frostii a few years ago. And then, fairly recently, it got moved back to Exudoporous frostii. This is a perfect example of a gothy mushroom and doesn't know what its name is. I personally call it the Red Wrinkled Flabbergaster because I love how this mushroom makes me feel, and it just makes me, it fills me with this exuberated, sense of wonder that there's just something so weird in the world. But nonetheless, I also enjoy watching the ping pong match that is this emerging science of mycology. All right, so we're at the 30-minute mark, so we're doing pretty good on time. Mushrooms of the Southeastern US. So I want to talk about edible mushrooms. I want to talk about some of the toxic mushrooms that we have. And I also want to give you a sense of, which mushrooms you may want to focus on learning if you're interested in foraging them for your, own consumption. I do want to say that culinary suggestions are all like highly subjective. And I'm also not going to talk about medicinal properties of mushrooms because I'm simply not qualified. I also want to admit I am not a very good chef. Like, there are some people who can take species that I'm like, yeah, that's very mediocre, and they turn them into these wonderful, wonderful dishes. And so, I have sort of the, I have a bit of an undergraduate palate, let's put it this way. And so the way that I contextualize mushrooms, there's a lot of variability when it comes to what is edible and what is not. And in my universe, I categorize mushrooms as edible or not based on whether or not they are more or less satisfying than a Hot Pocket. And the reality of it is there's a lot of mushrooms that are edible, but they're simply not as good as a Hot Pocket. And so I put them in this category of like, if it were an emergency, yes, absolutely. But Hot Pockets are sort of my like edible and choice line. And so I contextualize things sort of along that spectrum. So here's a quick key to edibility guidance. One of the things that I observe a lot of times on mushroom forums is someone will post a photo and say, this is a mushroom I found, is it edible? And people who are more seasoned will say, yes, it's edible, or no, it's not edible. And the conversation is really not very rich, or it gets a little bit even standoffish sometimes. And the reason for this is that there is, as I mentioned, a vast degree of variability between what is edible and what is tasty. So you have, your Hot Pockets and better and your lesser thans. So when I'm talking about edibility, I really put it on a spectrum of things that you would want to eat, things that you can't eat, things that are inedible because, you know, for instance, they are too woody or corky. That's one of the things that comes up a lot, is people will say, you know, is this reishi mushroom, for instance, edible? And it's like, well, it has the consistency of a wine cork in this case, so probably not, unless you prepare it in a certain way. So you have your edibles and tasties. You have your inedibles simply because you can't eat them. Then you have your edible, but I don't enjoy it. I did not place a, you know, this particular icon can be controversial. I know that some people adore Spam and can prepare it in wonderful ways. Because I don't like Spam, and this is my, you know, personal and highly subjective guidance, I'm just going to go and say this is the edible, but I don't particularly enjoy it category. When we're talking about adverse events, there's a couple of different categories of those. So first we have mushrooms that'll just basically give you the farts. This is not all that uncommon. And so, you know, I key mushrooms out by like, it's not, you could potentially feel a little farty as a result of it, but it's an uncommon reaction. Adverse reaction, semi-common, or sometimes, you know, things where people will get, you know, get sick to their stomachs. There are some mushrooms that people particularly are sensitive to. And then we have mushrooms that, in terms of like really what I would consider to be bad poisoning events, kind of two categories. One, potentially deadly events, and then extreme gastrointestinal upset. And the vast majority of like mushroom poisonings that we see that are, you know, bad mushroom poisonings are the like, I got sick and I was sick for a day or what have you, and then my body got rid of it and I moved on with my life. Also on the slides that follow, I have a differentiator between oak trees and beech trees. And the reason for this is that oak and beech are two of the mushroom trees that I really like in my area in the southeastern US. So oak trees just buddy up with all kinds of different interesting mushrooms, and beech trees do as well. And so those are kind of the two that I am always keeping an eye out for. This is not to say you can't find great mushrooms with pine and with hickory and with tulip poplar. Like, one of the great things about getting into mushrooms is it is a conduit for me to learn my trees and plants. But oak and beech are my two favorite mushroom trees. All right, so let's talk about Ladyporous. So there is a genus called Ladyporous. The common name is chicken of the woods, and we have a number of different species. So we have Ladyporous sulphureus, Ladyporous cincinnatus, Ladyporous gilbertsonii, and there's a variety that is a pallid gilbertsonii. That's very common down in like Texas in particular. And then we also have a couple of other Ladyporous genus mushrooms, including Ladyporous huroniensis. That's a really, really bad pronunciation there. But that's a northerly species that causes people a good bit of gastrointestinal upset. All right, so chicken of the woods in general is one of the easiest wild mushrooms to identify. Unfortunately, it does cause a reasonable number of people to feel ill. It is oftentimes a very like fleeting, you know, over the course of 6 to 12 hours they feel bad, but I definitely mention it because it's like one of the first wild mushrooms that most people ever try, and also one of the mushrooms that causes a good number of people to have a negative reaction. It's called chicken of the woods because it has a very, in its finest state, it has a very, very pleasing sort of poultry flavor to it. And, you know, when I say in its finest state, that's a very important distinction because chicken of the woods is a mushroom that grows very large. And so oftentimes the fruiting bodies can be, you know, 5 or more pounds. And they are, you know, a shelved polyporous mushroom. So a polypore is essentially a mushroom that has, instead of like bladed gills underneath, it has a porous surface. And so, you know, it's porous underneath. It's nice and almost flowery looking, and has these beautiful concentric growth zones in orangey colors and in some cases sort of a peachy color on the top. So you have this really big mushroom, but unfortunately it doesn't stay tender for very long. And so when you're harvesting chicken of the woods, it's very important to catch it at just the right moment. And so, you know, I have two pictures here of my favorite, and probably around here in my area, the most common species of Ladyporous, which is Ladyporous Cincinnatus. And this is the fruiting body when it's kind of in its most ideal form. So very rapidly, this mushroom will start to turn an orangier color. It also becomes much more fibrous. So identifying Ladyporous Cincinnatus is relatively simple. Almost all of the identification features for the other chicken of the woods species are the same. There's just you know, some minor distinctions between them. But you have you know, sort of concentric growth zones. It is a wood rotter, so you'll find it growing on wood, but also with Cincinnatus, very frequently, you'll find it growing at the base of trees, sort of in a big rosette, but it is, you know, decomposing wood that is just below the surface. When Ladyporous Cincinnatus is in its finest shape, when you harvest it, it will drop a tremendous amount of sort of whitish tinged water that will just soak your hand. And that's oftentimes a really good sign that the mushroom is nice and tender through and through. And that's when that poultry flavor really comes out. So if you harvest it a little bit later, you'll start to see it look a little bit more like the one that's on the left here. So Ladyporous Cincinnatus, as it gets a little older, it fans out, like its leaves start to get a bit flatter, and also it starts to be less brightly colorful, and it becomes more fibrous. And you start to get some sort of like unpleasant chemical flavors at that point in time. So it's a really good mushroom that can upset some people's stomachs. The Ladyporous, oh gosh, I'm going to kill it, but the Huron Ladyporous, so it's a northerly species that grows, you know, in association with conifer, is particularly problematic. And that is the species that has also given rise to this sort of generic prescription that you'll see in mushroom land of like, don't eat chicken of the woods that grows on pine. The reality is you shouldn't eat chicken of the woods that is Ladyporous huroniensis. There are other chicken of the woods species that grow on pine that cause problems. There are other chicken of the woods that don't grow on pine that cause problems. I personally have no issue with chicken of the woods, and so, you know, it's just important to note that it can make you feel crummy. So, you know, eat a small portion the first time. But I don't know what the numbers are, but, you know, usually I see like 1 or 2 people pop up per year and say it made me feel really bad. Another thing that makes Ladyporous really good for beginners, besides the fact that it has a nice flavor, it's really big and bright orange, so it's pretty easy to spot, is its lookalikes are, first of all, you're not terribly likely to misidentify it, but if you do, the lookalikes are all edible. So you have Bondarza berkelei, known as Berkeley's Polypore. That's looks very similar, sort of rosette shaped, but it's more of a like tan beige color than orangey and peachy color. We also have Mycorrhizal Species, which is the black staining polypore. Very similar fruiting body form, but it is sort of a lighter color, more of a almost you know, gray, sometimes blonde color, and it stains radically black when you handle it. I actually found one yesterday, and I still have black stain underneath my fingernails, even though I've tried to scrub it out. So when we say black staining polypore, we really mean black staining. All of these mushrooms are edible. Some people make jerky from them, and that's a really, that's the direction I kind of want to go if I'm going to expand in the direction of these sort of, you know, the fanned polyporous large mushrooms. We also have, I think, from a beginner's perspective, the best mushrooms to really get your head around are chanterelle mushrooms. So we have a lot of different species of chanterelles in the Cantharelis genus in North Carolina. I would be intellectually dishonest if I said I could reasonably field identify or distinguish between them, and several of them I'm sure are unnamed. That said, identifying mushrooms to chanterelle versus not chanterelle is a very, very simple affair. So first of all, these mushrooms are mycorrhizal, meaning they're mutualists. They grow in association with oak. I also find them growing with muscadine constantly. So it's a little sort of ground-lying grape vines, and that is a really, really dominant feature in all of my chanterelle patches. Because they are mutualist and mycorrhizal, they come back in the same spot year after year. That's another really nice thing about your mycorrhizal mushrooms, is they could just keep on trucking. You know, if you have a chicken of the woods, it's a wood rotter. It is eventually going to run out of wood and it will stop producing fruit. But your chanterelle patches will just keep going and going and going. So once you find them, you come back year after year. And that's sort of one of my favorite things to do, is go and visit my different patches and see who's doing what. So the Cantharelis genus contains a lot of different species that fruit sort of in a succession throughout the summertime. So we start to see the first ones in June, depending on the weather, you know, we see a number of them fruit throughout July and August. I've seen them as far into the year as October, but typically the real height of the season is in July. And you have a couple of different distinguishing features for chanterelles that makes them reasonably easy to identify, regardless of which particular species they are. First of all, they have what are called false gills. And so if you flip over a mushroom, and it's your cap and stem mushroom you buy at the store, it has these deep blade-like structures underneath. And they crumple off, like you can separate them from the cap flesh pretty easily. In the case of a chanterelle, if you flip it over, they're called false gills, so they're not deep or blade-like. They're much more like wrinkles. And so in the case of the mushroom that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, it's Cantharelis velutinus. This is a type of peachy chanterelle that is very, very wrinkled and forked. And so, if you look at the undersurface, it does not have gills in the classic sense at all. It also, those false gills run down the stem. That's called decurrence, and so that's another feature to look for. In the case of the mushrooms that are on the left, we have, and it's not clear which of the two species this is. This is either the ghost chanterelle, Cantharelis phasmatus, or Cantharelis deceptivus. So both of those species have really pale false gills underneath. So they have a nice golden egg yolk color on top. That's a really common color for chanterelles to be. And they have sort of a pale, and really when you look at them, they look kind of blade-like, the undersurfaces. But if you start to mess with them, you'll realize they aren't deep or blade-like, really. It's a superficial appearance, and you can scrape them right off with your fingernail in a sort of a continuous mass. So they're not, individual structures per se. Another thing that makes chanterelles really recognizable is if you split them open, they have the consistency of string cheese on the inside a little bit. So they're nice and stringy, a white, firm flesh. Some of our species do have a fruity aroma, some of them don't. A lot of the literature that's associated with chanterelles talks about an apricot aroma. That is, you will find that in some of the chanterelles that you find in the eastern United States, but it's not a universal. And so that's important to note. A lot of our chanterelles don't smell like anything at all. So identification feature-wise, again, you're really looking for that decurrent gilled, white-fleshed, oftentimes, sort of golden color, to peachy colored mushroom. And I say too peachy because we have a couple of different species that are more of a peach color. That I love them. Cantharelis velutinus is really common in the North Carolina Piedmont, and it's just a showstopper, like that sort of pinky color. It's kind of hard to get a good photograph, but when you see it in person and the morning dew is happening, it's all kinds of fabulous. All right, so for hunting chanterelles and collecting them to eat, they're really yummy, but I have a couple of things that I recommend. First of all, slicing them in half to check for bugs is really helpful. So, you get a lot of worms inside of wild mushrooms, and if you have a whole bunch of them, the worms can, in fact, migrate. They also will just continue to eat the mushrooms as they sit in your basket. So I slice them in half, and I assess basically how much worm I am comfortable with. And, I don't mind eating a few worm-holed mushrooms at all. As I mentioned, I'm pretty picky. That doesn't gross me out per se, but I really like my mushrooms to be nice and firm. So I slice them in half, also kind of to check to see if the flesh is consistent on the inside. With chanterelles, even if they appear very dry and very firm, you want to dry saute them before you add oil to cook them. And the reason for this is they have a lot of surface level water in them. And so what you want to do is just throw them in the pan, you know, hot, without any oil, and they will drop a tremendous amount of water in a minute or two. And it's really quite stunning, especially if you have mushrooms that seem very dry. But you, you know, allow them to drop that water off, and it will, you know, evaporate pretty rapidly, and then you can add oil. But if you do add oil before then, you have more of a risk of chanterelles becoming sluggy, and a sluggy chanterelle is a very upsetting thing. As I mentioned, they favor oak trees. They also like muscadine. And chanterelle-shaped garbage is one of the most remarkably common things, I think, in our built habitats, and so I wanted to take the time to complain about them. Another thing that I really love about chanterelle hunting is that my favorite mushrooms hide in chanterelle patches. So hedgehog mushrooms in the Hedgehog genus are absolutely my favorite, just because they're a delight to find, they're really pretty, they have this nice nutty flavor, and they're also nice and firm. And so if you can't cook terribly well like me, and you struggle with temperamental textures, hedgehog mushrooms are really, really useful. So in the eastern United States, we have roughly 17 different hedgehog species. This gives you a sense of like the breadth and depth of how mushroom taxonomy can really explode in your face. The deeper you go, the more the unknown expands before you, and the more clear it is that we have a tremendous amount to learn. That said, there's 17 at least species, but they're very easy to identify, and they don't look like anything else particularly. And the other things they look like are either inedible or really, really bitter, so you wouldn't be able to eat. So they have these little dentines underneath, so they're these little itty bitty teeth, which makes them, you know, obviously that's the reason that they're called hedgehogs, but also makes them a little difficult to clean, but it really is well worth it because, again, they have a nice sort of meaty, nutty thing going on for them. They're oftentimes sort of a nice, like, homemade vanilla ice cream color. We have a subgenus called Subgenius Alba that is very dominant in North Carolina. I see it a lot throughout the course of the summer and the fall. And Alba is for white, so these are lighter in color. There's a picture here, actually both of these are Subgenus Alba. And so, you know, they're really light colored mushrooms. And when you damage them, they very frequently stain orange. Sometimes it's bright carrot orange and it's really rapid and sudden. Sometimes you rub on it and it'll be a little bit brownish, like the one that's on the right-hand side. It's not nearly as sort of bright and alarmingly orange. But it's a very, very common feature with our hedgehog mushrooms. And again, they hide in chanterelle patches, and that's really fun because the top of them looks very similar to a chanterelle mushroom oftentimes. So as you can see, these mushrooms are not like a little, you know, like plopped perfect little cap that's circular. They're a little bit flowery looking and indeterminate. And so from the top, you'll oftentimes see a hedgehog mushroom, and it looks like a pale chanterelle that just didn't get enough sunshine, and then you flip it over and you see these lovely little teeth underneath, and then if you're me, you do a little dance and you put it on your pizza, and it's a wonderful way to end your day. All right, so let's also talk about Desarmollaria cespitosa. This is the ringless honey mushroom, one of the most noted mushrooms that shows up every year because it happens like the fruiting for this species is immediate and gigantic. So it's like about a week in September, everybody has these massive bouquets of stinky brown mushrooms in their front yards. And so every, you know, I almost want to just put up like an out-of-office email that's like, it is almost certainly the ringless honey mushroom that is growing in your yard in a giant mass. The Latin name, again, Desarmollaria cespitosa, that may change. So it recently changed from Armillaria to Besson's. Some people are unhappy with that. So Desarmollaria is basically just on its own with, you know, in terms of honey mushrooms overall. So we have a lot of different species that are honey mushrooms. All of them are in the Armillaria genus. Desarmillaria are our ringless honey mushrooms that are exceedingly common in North Carolina. And so they grow at the bases of trees. You'll see them go off again. It's usually like right around the first or second week of September, depending on the weather. They are edible with caution. Some people, have reported that it disagrees with them. A lot of folks will parboil them first and then cook them very thoroughly. These are also a highly parasitic fungus. So I have them in my backyard. They strangled out a lovely willow tree, and I am furious with them. But nonetheless, there's not a lot that you can do to stop these mushrooms once they move in. I already mentioned the Latin name, formerly Armillaria tabescens. And, again, it is possible that it will shift back to that name or something entirely different. Who knows? So the mushrooms themselves, they are not honey colored. So honey mushrooms as a group, like there's some that are a nice sort of honey, yellowy color. Ringless honey mushrooms, they share a lot of other features, but they do not have no honey color whatsoever. So they're sort of a brownish mushroom. They have a fibrous stem, a little bit of hairiness on the top of the caps. The photograph that I have here is when I would gather honey mushrooms and actually eat them because they're nice and young. But as they get larger, you have big old gills that start to develop that run down the stem, and they also drop a tremendous amount of white spore dust. And so they're very messy and very noticeable also because they come up in people's yards in these really big, obnoxious bouquets. All right, so we're running out of time, so I'm going to talk fast about Areoboletus betula. This is another one that I absolutely love. So boletus and boletes in general, you'll hear people colloquially talk about in mushroom land, is essentially a mushroom that instead of having underneath it gills or pores like we've been talking about with the chickens of the woods, they have a spongy, porous undersurface. So if you break it open, it almost looks like the tubes of baleen on a whale. So it's, looks like a spongy, porous undersurface. So that's what a bolete is. There's a whole stinking mess of species, and many of them are very challenging to identify because they change colors very radically, and a lot of other reasons. But Areoboletus betula is a really lovely edible one that's also, fortunately, quite easy to identify. So it is a nice, tall, fat stemmed mushroom, like relative to the cap size. So a lot of times you'll see a bolete mushroom, and porcini is sort of the like iconic bolete, and it's fat on the bottom and then has a nice fat cap as well. It kind of looks like a Super Mario mushroom a little bit. But Areoboletus betula, it has a long stem and kind of a nice, small cap, relatively speaking. So the other features that make it really distinct is it has yellow sort of shags and, an overlay of tissue over a reddish stem. And so that's a very distinctive feature. You can see really clearly in both photographs. The color of the cap changes over time. So you start out with a reddish color often, and it will start to turn, yellowy orange as the mushroom matures. But those yellow shags with the reddish stem stay consistent. You also have a big chunk of white mycelium at the base, and that's kind of unusual. Oftentimes the fruiting body will be a similar color to the, mycelium underneath. But when you pick this mushroom, it's got this big old hunk of white mycelium at the base. It has a yellowish sponge, and the spores are an olive color. So as this mushroom matures, that yellow sponge that you can see underneath starts to turn sort of an olivey color. Speaking of boletes, we have a tremendous number of them. I'm just going to highlight a couple of the different genera of them. So first we have Polyporous. This is the gill bolete genus. So this is a great example of how perplexing mushrooms can be. So you have boletes, which are, if you're trying to build like your knowledge system, they're mushrooms that have a sponge underneath, typically, except for Polyporous, which is genetically related to all of these spongy mushrooms, but it has gills underneath. So its common name is a contradiction in terms, the gilled bolete. But anyway, it is a highly common terrestrial mushroom. I have a lot of them in my backyard, and it's interesting to me, despite the fact that it has a slightly different, fertile surface, its genetic relationship with boletes being closer is really believable in a way, because even though like that very glaring difference exists, if you squint your eyes, that mushroom looks a lot more like a bolete in all other respects than you know, one of its sort of more guild colleagues. We also have Edibility ornithopes. This is a beautiful species that has what's called reticulation, and that's sort of just a fine network of tissue on top of the stem that gives it sort of this netted look. It's very, very pretty. But Edibility ornithopes has reticulation all the way down the stem. Really, really cool looking mushroom. We also have the Tylopolis genus, and these are oftentimes purple or lilac colored mushrooms. Tylopolis plumeo-violaceus is one of my favorites. This is just really cheerful purple mushroom, bitter as a son of a gun. So it's not edible, but it's really good to find for photographs. And in yet another exciting twist of how mushrooms buck all our expectations, Tylopolis as a genus is generally a lot of purple, lilac, brownish mushrooms, except for Tylopolis balui, which is on the other end of the color wheel and is a bright orange instead of a purple Tylopolis mushroom. But I love finding it because it looks basically like the fungal version of a construction cone. All right, so we also have Russula parvovirescens and the Russula crustosa group. These are cracked cap russulas. So I talked about russulas all the way at the beginning. They're super common. There are hundreds of them. But, you know, they're defined by being cap and stem mushrooms that have white gills, and they're very, very brittle. So they just break apart like a piece of chalk when you handle them. And many of them are edible. Many of them are very, very spicy, like cayenne pepper spicy. But Russula crustosa and Russula parvovirescens are really, you know, more desirable edibles, and they're very, very easy to identify because they have this sort of greenish cracked cap, and you can see it sort of has a quilted appearance to it. Russula parvovirescens is sort of a blue-green color. I love this photograph of a parkour snail on the Russula parvovirescens. That was one of my favorite finds from 2020. And then Russula crustosa is oftentimes not quite so much green as, you know, it's a little bit green, a little bit gray, sometimes a little bit purple, a little bit pink, oftentimes with this flash of lighter color in the middle. And as you can see, like the variability in mushroom shapes and forms and colors can be really, really, you know, quite radical. But nonetheless, you know, the consistent features are what make easy mushrooms easy. And in the case of the cracked cap russulas, this cracking appearance is a really consistent thing. Lactarius indigo group, I have to highlight you because I love you. This is one of the most beautiful mushrooms to find. I don't like to eat it. It oftentimes is very like mealy and gross, but it is this blue mushroom that has blue juice. Essentially, it is latex that you know, gives the entire genus Lactarius its name. So when you damage the gills, it basically starts to bleed blue juice all over the place. There are a couple of other mushrooms that have really colorful latex that I really like. So Lactarius paradoxus is another one that has sort of a mulberry colored latex that I'm very fond of. So when you find this sort of like light bluish, almost silver blue mushroom, sometimes with a little bit of green appearance, and you cut it apart and it starts squirting, you know, blue juice all over the place, you have one of the roughly 4 Lactarius indigo, you know, mushroom species. One of my favorite things about Lactarius indigo too that I can't get enough of is it has these little pits oftentimes on the stem, and you can see they're a much darker color. So you have like a light blue colored mushroom with concentric, you know, sort of growth zones with the dark, dark color of the latex, and then these dark colored pits that are just, I don't know, there's something very primally enjoyable about them. All right, I am almost out of time, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit, but I do want to talk about Amanita bisporigera and other white amanitas that are called destroying angels commonly. So we have a mushroom that is called the death cap, Amanita phalloides. That is one of the most commonly referred to like poisonous amanita mushrooms. That said, in the southeast we have a lot of different species that are probably far more common than Amanita phalloides. So they're called commonly destroying angels. They're beautiful white mushrooms, you know, very pristine looking oftentimes, that have a cup or sac of tissue at the base. You can see it very clearly in the photograph here. They also have a ring on the stem and white gills. And I do highly encourage you to, you know, learn about Amanitas, but in general, avoiding mushrooms that have white gills and also being very, very cautious of mushrooms that have any kind of material at the base of the stem is a good way to avoid Amanitas in general. So Amanitas as a whole, oftentimes they have a cup, sac, bulb, some sort of material at the base of the stem. This is also why it's very important, if you're going to get a mushroom identified, you have to pick the whole thing, take a picture of the whole fruiting body. We do have some really pleasant edible Amanitas. So we have the Amanita Jacksonii and other Amanitas in the Caesariae section. So this is a section of species, and they're reasonably, well, they're very, very common. So Amanita Jacksonii is probably the best known of them. They're these really bright, sort of orangey yellow mushrooms with yellow gills and this beautiful orangey ring on the, you know, skirt on the stem, and then a big sort of cup of tissue, like an egg, at the base. And, you know, even though Amanitas in general are pretty, you know, advanced mushrooms, there's kind of an exception for Amanita section Caesariae because they are so distinct and distinguishable. So you have Amanita Jacksonii. It's a beautiful mushroom. Definitely recommend that you study up on it a little bit. But it is distinct from its fellows in the Amanita section Caesariae because it has sort of orangey tissue on the stem that leaves little stretch marks or chevrons. And you can see in two of these photographs pretty clearly this you know, yellow stem with the chevrons on it. There are other Amanitas in section Caesariae that are, you know, this reddish vermilion color. They have striations, so the little stripy grooves around the rim of the cap, that's another important feature. But they don't have the, you know, the material that's on the stem. And that's what distinguishes Amanita Jacksonii, like in the strict sense, from other Amanitas. So Amanita AR01, that stands for Arkansas 01, which is an Amanita that looks very similar, except it has, you know, cracking edges, or at least that's how I distinguish it. So the margins of the cap are very cracked. And then there's an Amanita that I have in this photograph. I have no idea what it is. It looks exactly like Amanita Jacksonii, except it doesn't have any orange tissue. So if you want to be very fancy, these sort of reddish orange Amanitas that look like Amanita Jacksonii without the orange tissue on the stem, you could call them Amanita section Caesariae stirps hemiboffa, or similar. So we also have other yellow Amanitas in section Caesariae. So we have Arkansana and Vaningiana. I don't want to go into that too deeply, except to say that we have sort of you know, yellow Caesar mushrooms and red yellow Caesar mushrooms. Finally, Chlorophyllum molybdites. This is the mushroom that probably causes more mushroom poisoning than most others. It won't kill you, but it's very common, it's very conspicuous, and it looks kind of tasty. So it's called the green spored parasol mushroom, or if you're very juvenile like me, the green gilled lawn boob. It's very common in lawns and yards, so people notice it. It grows in large rings and arcs, and that's another thing. It's really fun to find because you can be like, look at the size of that ring. That is the outer perimeter of that mycelial mat. And that just sort of, for me, reinforces the sheer size of this organism and how impressive they are, that you just have this thing hanging out, you know, sort of doing its best to be inconspicuous except when it's fruiting. These mushrooms, they have a sort of really nice appearance. They look like a parasol in a lot of ways, and they have sort of brownish scales on them, whitish gills underneath, but those gills start to turn sort of a greenish color as the mushroom matures, and they start to look a sickly, sort of pickly green, and they will make you sick. They won't kill you, but they will give you extreme, short-lived GI upset. And one final thing, this doesn't always happen, but sometimes they stain a little red, which can be a little bit ambiguous. There are other mushrooms that are desirable that stain red. So I mention that because it is kind of an interesting reaction. So I am certainly, beyond time, so I appreciate your patience with my babbling. Mushroom arts and leisure, I just want to, really reinforce that just because mushrooms aren't fruiting doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. Just because you don't find mushrooms in the condition you want them doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. Me, for instance, I have never found a jack-o'-lantern mushroom that glows in the dark. So Omphalotus oludens is a mushroom commonly called the jack-o'-lantern, and it can be mildly bioluminescent. I have never found a specimen that did that, and so an interest of, I guess, satisfying that fantasy for myself, I was like, I'm just going to draw them and paint them with glow-in-the-dark paint. I also recommend organizing your photos, drawing your photos, looking at other people's photos, and keeping track of all of the wintertime mycology name changes. This time of year is very exciting for me because it's kind of like stepping back into Latin season. So, I have to remind myself of how to pronounce things, how to recognize things, and that's always a really rewarding part of the year. So here's a sample of some of the art projects that I work on. If you're interested, I do have some mushroom t-shirts at mushroomanna.com that have some of my different drawings and paintings on them. So as you can see, I keep myself busy in the winter months watching cheesy television. I also really, one of the things that I love about this hobby is that the people in Mushroomland are oftentimes very, very generous with their knowledge. And so it's wonderful to get out in nature and to become familiar with these organisms, but it's also really rewarding to be a part of a community where new knowledge is being created all the time. And so there are opportunities for learning from other people that are really unique, and I've made some very great friends, even if I didn't find any mushrooms with them. This is a picture of me and my buddy Devin before we found, I think, all of maybe, 5 to 10 different species over the course of 5 or 6 hours. But it's really a wonderful time, a great opportunity to get out in the woods. So really, I recommend that you spend some time doing it yourself. I never tire of finding wild mushrooms. So from the very first time I was on that crummy date, and I'm like, that is a chanterelle, and I have found food in the woods for myself to this very day. I just am overjoyed and flabbergasted and amazed by these organisms, and I hope you get a lot out of them too. I'm going to sign off and end my broadcast, at least in theory. I hope you all have a wonderful remainder of your day.